She was only 6, crying on the roadside, trying to sell her school bag to save her mother's life. He was a billionaire, cold and heartless, or so he thought. But when their worlds collided, a hidden truth neither expected would break him to his core. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching me from, and what's the time there right now? And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these emotional stories. Ethan Blake sat in the back seat of his luxury black car, the city lights reflecting off the tinted glass as silence pressed against him, his mind replaying the ruthless boardroom arguments he had silenced just hours ago. But for all his power and billions, his penthouse still felt like an empty glass cage waiting for him, and tonight, something strange tugged at his chest as he loosened his tie, trying to shake the loneliness away, when suddenly, his eyes caught a small fragile figure standing near the dim streetlight on a deserted corner. A little girl no older than 6, trembling under the night breeze, her golden hair tangled and catching the pale glow like strands of sorrowful sunlight, her blue eyes swollen with tears, clinging tightly to a small pink school bag pressed against her chest, as though it were her last piece of dignity, and Ethan instinctively leaned forward, instructing the driver to slow down, curiosity and something deeper, an ache he thought buried forever, making him want a closer look. And as the car stopped, the sight broke through the armor he had built around his heart. The little girl, wiping her tears with tiny hands, stepping timidly toward passing strangers, her voice shaking, whispering words no child should ever have to say, offering to sell her school bag in exchange for help. But people walked by, some brushing her off with irritated glances, others pretending not to hear, and Ethan clenched his jaw because in a world where he could sign away millions with a flick of his pen, here was a child begging for mercy, selling her education, her hope, her future, for something as desperate as survival, and for a long moment he simply watched, his chest tightening with every tear that slid down her pale cheeks, until one man shoved her gently aside, muttering cruelly about beggars, and Ethan's patience snapped. He opened his door, stepped into the cold air, and his polished shoes crunched against the gravel as the little girl froze, startled by the tall figure approaching her, fear flickering in her eyes before she masked it with bravery far beyond her years. And Ethan lowered his voice, softer than he had ever spoken in the office towers where men feared his name, asking gently, "Why are you selling your school bag, little one?" And the girl's lips trembled as she hugged the bag tighter, her small body shivering, her words barely more than a whisper. "I don't need it anymore. I need to save my mommy. She's sick and I can't let her go." And Ethan felt his breath hitch because he had heard countless pleas from businessmen, partners and competitors, but nothing had ever pierced him like those innocent words, and though the night traffic hummed distantly, in that moment it felt like the world had gone silent, leaving only the sound of a child's grief. And he studied her carefully, noting the worn-out shoes with holes at the toes, the faded dress that had lost its color, the way her small hands trembled but still held her bag with determination, and he realized this wasn't just desperation, this was love, the raw, selfless love of a child willing to sacrifice her own chance at tomorrow to save the one person she couldn't live without. And Ethan swallowed hard, lowering himself to her level, his tailored suit brushing the dusty ground as he knelt in front of her, and he saw her flinch slightly, unused to kindness, expecting rejection again, but instead he asked softly, "What's your name?" And after a pause, she whispered, "Lily," her voice carrying both fragility and strength, and the name echoed in Ethan's chest like a bell striking a memory he couldn't place, and though he didn't know why, something about her face, her eyes, her courage stirred emotions he thought long buried, and he felt a protective instinct he had never known ignite like fire in his veins. And as Lily tried to hold back fresh tears, Ethan reached into his coat for his wallet, pulling out crisp bills. But when he tried to hand them to her, she shook her head stubbornly, her tiny chin lifting in pride. "I don't want money for free. You have to take the bag." And Ethan froze, because he had never seen such dignity in such broken circumstances, and for the first time in his life, the billionaire who had everything felt powerless, unsure of how to respond, standing there on a dark street corner with a child who refused pity, whose strength made him ashamed of every moment he had ever wasted on greed. And as his heart hammered painfully, he realized he couldn't just walk away, not tonight, not ever, because Lily's tears had become his own unspoken wound, and something told him this encounter was only the beginning of a story that would change everything he thought he knew about life, love, and himself. Ethan remained kneeling before the little girl, his eyes locked on hers, as though the universe had chosen this moment to strip away the walls he had built for years, and when he finally found his voice, it carried none of the steel that usually made men cower in boardrooms, but instead a rare gentleness, almost fragile, as he whispered, "Tell me, Lily, why are you selling your school bag?" And her tiny fingers tightened around the faded pink straps, her knuckles white as though letting go of that bag would mean surrendering the last piece of her childhood. And with a trembling breath she lifted her tear-streaked face toward him, blue eyes shimmering with an ache no 6-year-old should ever carry, her lips parting slowly as though each word weighed 1,000 pounds. "I just want to save my mommy," she said, her voice breaking mid-sentence, forcing her to swallow her sobs. "She's sick. Really sick, and I don't need school if she's not here." And in that instant Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest, not the dull ache of loneliness he had grown accustomed to, but something far more piercing, like her words had reached into the core of his soul and struck a part of him that had been long dead. And though the streets buzzed with honking cars and hurried footsteps, for him the world narrowed into the fragile courage of this child, and he found himself momentarily unable to breathe. Because in her desperation he saw the innocence of love so raw it could destroy him, and for the first time in years, he envied someone, not for money, power, or status, but for the purity of a little girl's heart that held her mother above everything else, even her own dreams, and he swallowed hard, reaching into his wallet with hands that suddenly felt clumsy, pulling out a thick wad of cash that could easily buy her more than 100 school bags, holding it out carefully as though it were an offering. But Lily shook her head with stubborn defiance, tears rolling down her cheeks, yet her chin lifted with a kind of pride that startled him. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I don't want it for free. You have to take the bag." And Ethan blinked, stunned by the dignity in her refusal, by the strength hiding inside a fragile frame, and something inside him twisted, because he had met grown men who would kneel at his feet for a fraction of that money. Yet here was a child who would rather starve than take pity, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of everything he had lost in the pursuit of success, integrity, innocence, and the courage to love without conditions, and his throat tightened as he slowly lowered the money, realizing she wouldn't accept it. And for a moment he felt powerless, the billionaire who could buy skyscrapers and empires reduced to a man struggling to comfort a little girl who refused his help, and he studied her closely, the way her small chest heaved with shallow breaths, the way she clutched that worn bag like it was both a lifeline and a burden, and he wondered how long she had been standing there, how many cold glances and cruel words she had endured from strangers who had turned away, and guilt gnawed at him. Because hadn't he done the same his whole life? Turned away from pain, sealed himself inside wealth so he wouldn't have to see suffering, and now here it was, staring him in the face with the piercing honesty of a child, and though he longed to argue, to tell her that school mattered, that she shouldn't give up her dreams, he realized such words would mean nothing to a girl who had already decided that nothing mattered more than saving her mother, and in that realization he felt something crack open inside him, a warmth he hadn't known since his youth. The kind that terrified him because it meant caring again, and caring always came with the risk of pain. Yet as he watched her tiny frame tremble under the night air, he knew he couldn't let her carry this weight alone, and though she had rejected his money, he found himself searching for another way, his mind racing, his heart pounding, and before he could speak, Lily pushed the bag toward him, her little hands shaking but her gaze steady. "Please, take it. It's all I have." And Ethan stared at the faded pink fabric, realizing it was more than a school bag. It was her sacrifice, her last act of hope, and something in him whispered that if he took it, he would also be accepting the responsibility she carried, a responsibility far heavier than any empire he had ever built. And as his fingers brushed against the worn strap, a shiver ran through him, because he knew in that moment his life would never be the same again. Ethan's hand lingered on the faded strap of the bag, his heart heavy with the weight of what it symbolized, when Lily suddenly pulled it back and whispered, "If you don't want it, maybe someone else will." Then turned quickly, her tiny frame almost swallowed by the night as she began walking toward the shadows at the far end of the street, and without thinking, Ethan straightened, his long strides closing distance as he followed her, his polished shoes clashing against the uneven ground, each step echoing with a mix of curiosity, unease, and a strange protective instinct he couldn't explain. And though he could have returned to his car, back to his world of glass towers and empty triumphs, something stronger than logic urged him forward, so he stayed just a few paces behind, watching as Lily clutched her school bag and hurried down narrow alleys lined with peeling walls and broken lamps, places Ethan had never stepped in his life, and every turn revealed harsher poverty, children sleeping on doorsteps, men arguing over scraps, the stench of dampness seeping into his lungs, and yet Lily walked with purpose, as though she had done this countless times before, until she finally stopped at a crumbling doorway barely holding onto its frame, pushing it open with a creak that echoed despair, and Ethan hesitated for a moment, realizing he was crossing into a world far from his own. But then he followed her inside, and the sight froze him. The room was dim, lit by a single flickering bulb, walls cracked with age, a thin mattress on the floor where a woman lay pale and trembling, her chest heaving with shallow coughs that sounded like shattered glass in her lungs, and Lily rushed to her side instantly, kneeling beside the frail figure, whispering softly, "Mommy, I'm back. I tried to sell it, I really did." Her little voice breaking with guilt, and the woman, Grace, slowly opened her eyes, blue like lilies but dulled by illness, and when she saw her daughter, a faint smile curved her lips before her gaze shifted past her child, landing on Ethan's tall figure framed in the doorway, and her expression changed instantly, alarm flashing in her weak eyes as she tried to push herself up, coughing violently. "Lily, who is this man?" she rasped, her voice hoarse and lined with suspicion, and Ethan stepped forward cautiously, his presence filling the small room. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a conqueror. He felt like an intruder in a sacred space of suffering and love, and his usual confident tone softened as he said, "My name is Ethan. I saw your daughter on the road. She was trying to sell her school bag." And Grace's eyes welled with shame and pain, her body trembling as she clutched Lily's hand tighter, whispering harshly, "You shouldn't bring strangers here." But before she could say more, another fit of coughs overtook her, so violent that Lily cried out, patting her back desperately, tears filling her small eyes, and Ethan's chest clenched at the sight, his instincts screaming to act. So without another word he pulled out his phone, calling his personal physician, his voice sharp with urgency, giving the broken address, demanding immediate arrival with medicine, and when he hung up, he moved to the side of the bed, kneeling carefully, pulling a bottle of water from his coat and offering it, his hands unsteady in a way he had never experienced while sealing billion-dollar deals, and Grace looked at him with both gratitude and distrust, her lips parting to protest, but exhaustion won, and she sipped slowly, her breaths easing slightly, and Lily looked up at Ethan, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes shining with something like relief. And in that moment, he realized this fragile home filled with cracks and shadows had more warmth than his entire mansion, because here, even in sickness, love was alive, and it wrapped around him in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. And when the doctor finally arrived carrying his kit, Ethan hovered nearby, listening intently as he examined Grace, his brows furrowed at the sound of her lungs, prescribing urgent medicine, instructing rest, and Ethan, without hesitation, paid for everything on the spot, his tone brooking no refusal, and though Grace tried to argue weakly, murmuring, "We can't accept this," he silenced her gently, his eyes meeting hers with rare sincerity. "Let me help, please." And something in his voice made her stop fighting, her gaze softening as though she sensed he wasn't here as a businessman, but as a man who had stumbled into a moment that was changing him. And as the doctor prepared the first dose, Lily clutched Ethan's hand suddenly, her tiny fingers gripping his larger ones, and the spark of trust in her touch sent a warmth through him he hadn't felt in years, a warmth that frightened and healed him at the same time. And as Grace's breathing steadied under the care he had arranged, Ethan sat quietly on the cracked chair by her bedside, and for the first time in countless nights, he didn't feel the emptiness of his empire pressing on him. Instead he felt something unfamiliar but achingly real, human connection. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself drawn back to the crumbling little house more often than he would ever admit, at first convincing himself it was only to make sure Grace was recovering and Lily was safe, but soon realizing that each visit chipped away at the cold shell he had built around his heart, and though his office demanded his presence and contracts piled up on his desk, he began rearranging his schedule, slipping away from boardrooms and dinners with investors to drive down narrow streets that smelled of damp walls and resilience, where a little girl with golden hair would run to the door at the sound of his car, her laughter like sunlight piercing through the fog of his life, and at first she looked at him with caution, testing his intentions, but as days passed she started to open, showing him scraps of paper covered with childish drawings, stick figures holding hands, lopsided houses with crooked roofs, and when she shyly handed him one with blue crayon eyes drawn too big, she giggled softly and whispered, "It's you, Mr. Kind Eyes." And Ethan, a man used to titles, like Sir, and CEO, and Chairman, felt something unclench in his chest at the innocence of a name no one had ever dared to give him, and he kept the crayon drawing folded neatly in his wallet as if it were worth more than his stock shares. And with every passing day, Lily's trust grew, her tiny hands tugging at his sleeve to show him her schoolwork, her little voice asking endless questions about the tall glass buildings he worked in, while Grace watched from the bed or the chair by the window, her face softening when she saw her daughter smile, yet always shadowed with unease whenever Ethan's gaze lingered too long, and though she thanked him often, her tone carried a hesitancy, as though she feared gratitude might open a door she was not ready to walk through, and Ethan noticed it most when conversations drifted toward Lily's father, because each time he gently asked, Grace's hands would tremble, her eyes darting to the floor, her lips pressing tight before she changed the subject quickly, coughing to mask her discomfort. And though Ethan respected her silence, the avoidance left him restless, stirring questions he could not silence at night, lying awake in his penthouse staring at the city skyline, haunted not only by Grace's secrecy, but by his own memories, for he too carried a wound carved years ago, when he had once loved a woman with every beat of his heart only to lose her without warning, a loss that had driven him into ambition's cold embrace, making him vow never to feel again, and now here he was, sitting on a cracked chair in a humble room, listening to a child hum softly as she braided her doll's hair, feeling warmth seep into him that he had denied himself for so long, and it terrified him, because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain, yet he couldn't stop returning, couldn't stop watching the way Lily's eyes lit up when she saw him, couldn't ignore the way his chest tightened when Grace's tired smile flickered with gratitude, and as the days blurred into weeks, suspense hung like an unspoken storm in the air, because beneath he laughter and drawings and gentle moments, a secret pulsed between them, a truth Grace guarded fiercely, and Ethan, though softened by their presence, was determined to uncover it, unaware that the answer would change everything he thought he knew about his past, his heart, and his future. Ethan found himself driving past the small neighborhood more often than he intended, each time convincing himself it was business that pulled him there, though deep down he knew it was neither deals nor contracts, but a 6-year-old with golden hair and eyes that carried the weight of the world. On one such evening, Lily greeted him with a shy smile, clutching a crayon drawing she had made of him standing beside her, and when he crouched to admire it, she tugged his sleeve and asked if he liked ice cream, so he took her hand for the first time, walked her to a little shop at the corner, and watched as her face lit up brighter than the neon lights outside when she tasted the strawberry scoop. His heart, long frozen by years of ambition and loss, began to thaw. Later, he bought her new storybooks, her laughter echoing in his ears long after she skipped home with them, and without telling anyone, he settled her overdue school fees, signing the forms discreetly so that Lily could continue her education without interruption, because the thought of her giving up learning broke something inside him. At his company headquarters, his employees exchanged whispers, wondering about the sudden gentleness in their boss, who once ruled with iron precision, but now paused to look at the clouds outside his office window, or smiled faintly when he spotted a child walking with her mother across the street. Grace noticed the changes too, and thanked him softly whenever he came by, though her gaze never lingered long, and behind her grateful smile there remained a shadow, as if she feared that kindness always demanded a price, as if she carried a truth she dared not confess. Ethan didn't press, though the question of Lily's absent father tugged at him with every interaction. Instead, he focused on the bond. that was blossoming, on the way Lily called him Mr. Kind Eyes, in her innocent voice, the way she trusted him enough to slip her hand into his without hesitation, the way she asked him to read her stories at night when her mother's cough grew too heavy to allow her rest, the way she looked at him with admiration he hadn't felt worthy of in years. He began to feel something unfamiliar, something more than obligation or pity. It was belonging, fragile but undeniable, like the quiet hum of a lullaby he thought he had forgotten. And though he never admitted it out loud, with every passing day, Lily felt less like a stranger's child, and more like a piece of his own heart returned to him. A bond unspoken yet powerful, one that even Grace seemed to notice as her eyes shimmered with both gratitude and fear, a fear that only deepened Ethan's curiosity, a fear that whispered of a hidden truth waiting to shatter everything he thought he knew. The night was darker than usual, heavy clouds pressing down on the city, while rain tapped against the narrow window of Grace's small home, and inside that fragile space, Lily lay curled on the thin mattress, shivering with fever, her tiny hands pressed against her stomach as soft whimpers escaped her lips, her golden hair sticking to her damp cheeks while her blue eyes, once bright with innocence, now looked dull and glassy. Grace hovered helplessly beside her, her own frail body trembling as she pressed a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead, whispering broken pleas for her baby to stay alive. But her cough racked her chest and bent her double until she gasped for breath and forced herself back toward Lily, refusing to let weakness pull her away, the small room filled with the haunting sound of the child's shallow breathing mixed with the faint scent of medicine and damp clothes, and just as Grace's strength wavered, headlights cut 3 hours. The broken curtains. A sleek black car screeching to a halt outside, its engine dying before firm footsteps splashed through puddles. The door creaked open, and Ethan Blake entered, his coat dripping rainwater, his sharp eyes falling instantly upon the pale girl burning with fever, and for the first time in years the cold armor he wore cracked as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees, touching her skin, and feeling panic seize his chest with a force he didn't recognize. And in that moment he scooped her fragile body into his arms, with a desperation that surprised even him, as Lily stirred faintly, murmuring, "Don't let Mommy cry." Words that ripped straight through his core until his throat tightened, and he whispered hoarsely, "I won't." Then turned to Grace and thundered, "Get in the car now!" Leaving no room for hesitation as she obeyed, coughing into her sleeve while he carried Lily through the storm, shielding her from the pounding rain, laying her gently in the back seat where Grace clutched her hand while he slammed his door shut and tore into the night, ignoring red lights and traffic laws, his heart racing louder than the storm as his mind screamed one relentless thought, "Save her." And finally the hospital's glowing sign rose like salvation, his car skidding into the emergency entrance as nurses rushed to him, taking Lily onto a stretcher while he barked her symptoms with urgency. But when the doctor demanded her medical history and asked about her father's records, Ethan faltered, realizing with crushing weight that he knew nothing about her past, and he turned to Grace, urging her to answer, yet she froze, her lips trembling, her body quaking with some unseen war, until finally she pressed her hands to her face and sobbed, and when Ethan demanded again, her voice broke, whispering the words that shattered everything. "Her father is you, Ethan," and silent. Micah's followed like thunder after lightning as Ethan staggered back, his pulse roaring in his ears, disbelief cutting through him like a knife as he stammered, "What did you say?" Only for Grace to lower her hands, tears streaming, and choke out, "Lily is your daughter." A confession that shook him to his core, his knees nearly buckling as the sterile walls closed in, and his entire identity spun out of control, his mind crying, it wasn't possible while his heart recognized the truth in every memory. Her smile, her laughter, the way she called him Mr. Kind Eyes, all aligning with brutal clarity, and as Grace's sobs filled the space she explained in halting words how she had once been his first love, how his powerful family had destroyed them with threats and lies, how she had discovered she was pregnant only after leaving, and how she had raised Lily alone to protect her from rejection, each word tearing Ethan apart as guilt rose like a tidal wave, drowning him in the realization that while he lived in wealth and cold success, his daughter had stood on a roadside trying to sell her school bag to save her mother, and now the truth burned him alive, leaving him trembling against the wall, clutching his head as images of 6 lost years consumed him, 6 birthdays missed, 6 winters without her tiny arms around him, 6 times she cried herself to sleep without a father's comfort, until his tears finally broke free, hot and unrelenting, and for the first time in years the ruthless CEO mask collapsed, leaving a man who was no longer a stranger but a father, his face pressed against the cold hospital glass as he gazed at the fragile girl lying unconscious inside, whispering through ragged sobs, "My daughter," and hearing Grace's trembling reply, "Yes, our daughter." Words that changed him forever as his heart shattered and rebuilt itself in a single breath, replacing his old emptiness with a fierce vow as his eyes burned with determination. He would not lose her, not now, not ever, because fate had stolen 6 years but had given him a second chance, and this time he would fight heaven and hell to keep his daughter safe in his arms. Ethan stood frozen at the hospital window, his heart still raw from the truth that had just torn down every wall around him, and before he could gather himself, the sound of urgent voices filled the corridor as doctors rushed past with clipped orders. Grace suddenly clutching her chest as her body shook with violent coughs, her frail form collapsing into the arms of a nurse who shouted for immediate assistance, and Ethan's pulse spiked as panic surged once more, this time not only for his daughter, but for the woman he once loved who had carried his child in silence. Lily, though weak, stirred in her hospital bed and whispered for her mother, her tiny hand reaching out helplessly as Ethan rushed to her side, gripping her trembling fingers and forcing a smile he did not feel, whispering promises that he would never leave her again, that he would stay until both she and her mother were safe. But deep inside, dread tightened around his chest like chains as the surgeons wheeled Grace toward the operating theater, their words sharp. She needed urgent surgery if she had any chance of survival, her condition more fragile than they had expected, years of untreated illness eroding her strength until she was now balancing between life and death. Ethan, who had always believed money could solve every problem, barked orders without hesitation, demanding the best doctors, the finest equipment, even summoning specialists from abroad, his empire's wealth now a weapon he would wield not for power or prestige, but for love, desperation, and redemption. And yet even as he signed checks and secured approvals, fear gnawed at him, because this was a battle money alone might not win. He returned to Lily's side, sitting in the stiff chair by her bed as she stared at him with tear-filled eyes that seemed to ask questions no child should ever carry. And when she whispered, "Will Mommy come back?" his throat closed painfully, but he cupped her small hands in his large trembling ones and said with quiet conviction, "Yes, because I will not let her go, not this time." Though inside he fought the terror of uncertainty. As hours dragged like centuries, the sterile corridors seemed to hold their breath, nurses moving briskly, machines humming, while Ethan remained rooted in that chair, never releasing Lily's hand, watching her fragile chest rise and fall, realizing with every heartbeat how much of his life he had wasted chasing numbers and deals, while the real treasures, love, family, belonging, had been stolen by pride and silence. Now, as suspense thickened with every second the red light above the surgery room remained lit, his mind replayed every memory of Grace, the laughter they once shared, the fire in her eyes when she challenged him, the warmth of her embrace when the world seemed too heavy, and he knew with brutal clarity that losing her again would break him beyond repair. But even as fear consumed him, a stubborn fire ignited in his soul, because this time he was not the man who let others decide his fate. He was not the cold CEO who measured worth in profits. He was a father and a man in love, fighting for the family he had been denied. And as Lily leaned against his arm and drifted into restless sleep, he pressed a trembling kiss to her golden hair, and swore silently to the heavens that if Grace survived, he would rebuild everything that had been lost, not with wealth or status, but with loyalty, care and love, because nothing else mattered anymore. And so the night stretched on with unbearable tension. Ethan's eyes locked on the operating room doors, his heart pounding with every tick of the clock, caught in the cruel balance between hope and despair, knowing that the outcome of this battle for life would decide not only Grace's fate but the future of the family he was desperate to finally claim as his own. Grace survived the surgery, though weak and pale, her first breath after waking felt like a second chance at life, and as Ethan stood by her bedside holding Lily close, the hospital room carried an air of relief and trembling hope, for he had been a man who once believed his heart was frozen, but now he couldn't stop the tears that blurred his vision as Grace whispered his name softly, her voice cracked with both love and pain from years gone by. And in that moment, Ethan knew he could no longer hide behind the walls he had built around himself, so he gathered the courage to stand before Grace and Lily, his voice trembling yet steady with conviction, as he confessed before the doctors, nurses, and whoever else was listening, that Lily was his daughter, his flesh and blood, his heart reborn in the little girl who had unknowingly rescued him from his emptiness. And when he turned to Grace, his soul poured out the words he had buried in silence for so long, apologizing for every tear she had shed, for the nights she had cried alone, for the burden she carried without his arms to hold her, promising that never again would he let pride, family pressure or fear tear them apart. And Grace, still weak, let tears roll down her cheeks because she had waited so long to hear those words, though part of her still trembled with doubt. But when Ethan gently placed Lily's tiny hand into both of theirs, forming a circle of warmth, Lily's tear-filled smile broke the heaviness of the moment as she whispered with childlike innocence, "Now I don't have to sell my school bag, I have a family instead." And that single line pierced Ethan's heart deeper than anything, because it was the purest truth spoken from the lips of a child who had endured too much pain. And with that, Grace squeezed his hand softly as if to say she was ready to begin again, ready to heal the wounds of the past, and Ethan leaned down pressing his forehead against hers, whispering that he loved her and their daughter more than the empire he once chased, more than the wealth he once believed was his only purpose, and the nurses passing by couldn't help but glance in with teary eyes because the sight of a once cold and untouchable man, kneeling in vulnerability before the fragile woman he loved, and the little girl who had changed him, was more powerful than any fortune. And as the days went on, Ethan spared no effort to rebuild the life they were denied, arranging the best doctors for Grace, the best education for Lily, but more importantly giving them his time, his laughter, his warmth, and his presence, the things money could never buy. And when they finally walked out of the hospital together as a family, the world outside seemed brighter, the sky bluer, and every step they took hand in hand felt like rewriting destiny. For the past had been cruel, but the future promised love, kindness, and a home filled with care. And though scars of the years apart would remain, they no longer felt like chains but reminders of how strong their love truly was. And as the sun set that evening, Lily nestled between them, her small arms holding on to both with a grip full of certainty, her laughter ringing like music that healed their weary souls, and Ethan knew he had found his true fortune not in gold or power, but in the fragile, resilient hearts of Grace and Lily, his family, his redemption, his new beginning.